And welcome to the next session of our National Unitarian Fellowship Day Conference. And this afternoon, as you'll know, we have a speaker, Professor Woodhead. I'm going to hand over actually to Tony Can to do the introductions because he's known Linda and we've worked with her over the years. So thank you, Tony, for the question.
Thank you. When the other Tony told me about this conference and we discussed speakers, there was only one person that really came into my mind, and that was Professor Woodhead. I must say that I agreed to contact Linda. It was quite some time ago that we worked together and I did quite a lot of Lancaster. And I wasn't very hopeful that we could persuade him to come today. But actually there's a really key issue that worries me deeply. And it's how, as our churches collapse, never mind Sunday schools, how we are going to teach ethics, religion, morals, in the future. And it was wonderful when Linda agreed to come talk because it's something that I'm deeply, deeply interested in. And we are actually talking together in my other life and my questions, whether we could do something there to help in that area. But it's a more general question and one which we need all to understand and look for answers. So Linda's going to tell us what the answers are.
No pressure from Tony. Well, thank you very much for coming. It's lovely to come up to Manchester. As Tony said, I was at Lancaster University most of my career at the university there, but for the last 2 years I moved down to London. I'm at King's College now. I needed a change. But it's lovely to be back in the northwest. Have some of you got teaching backgrounds yourselves, past or present? Yes. Anyone teach RE? Okay, good. Got some experts around who can help us get this question through. So the question is, as Tony said, about the future of how we teach religion and ethics in schools particularly. I teach in university, so I do more adult education, but I've always been, I think RE has a particularly close relationship in schools and in the way it's taught at university, more than some subjects. You know, if you teach maths, probably in university, probably what's going on in maths in schools doesn't greatly influence what's going on in maths in higher education. But the way that religion is taught in schools very much influences the field of theology and religious studies in universities. Because it's a living subject in which teachers learn from pupils, and then that goes up as well to university teachers, and there's a good kind of circulation of ideas between the sectors. So, even if you're not an RE teacher, do you remember having RE or RI, religious instruction, lessons when you were at school? You all remember it. That's something, isn't it? At least you remember it. Right. And of course it's a funny subject because it sort of goes through the formal and informal curriculum. So there are assemblies, school assemblies, which are sort of religious, were more in the past. And there's RE, teaching, lessons. And then of course there are some faith schools that have more of all of those things. So it does go through schools. And it's compulsory, which is why all of you remember it. Because we would all have had to do it. I had to do it as well, from primary all the way through. It's a compulsory subject. But there are some strange paradoxes about religion in schools, very sort of British contradictions. One is it's compulsory, but you don't have to do it. Do you know why you don't have to do it? It's an opt-out subject. Parents can opt their children out of it. And that's you can say that as well, that's a human rights law thing. And it goes right back to 1944. And the idea that RE would be confessional, you'd be proselytizing, you'd be evangelizing. And therefore Jewish people and others at that time wanted an opt-out. So that still remains, even though the subject has become much more like any other subject. It shouldn't be evangelizing, but still people can and do opt out if their parents ask the school to do it, they have a right to. So it's compulsory, but you don't have to do it. Same through assemblies. And it's the one subject, unlike any other school curriculum subject, where the legislation hasn't changed significantly since 1944. It's the one subject that's not in the national curriculum. So there's been enormous, lack of change in a way, on the one hand, legislatively, but as you will all know, it's changed enormously in practice in the way that it happens and it's taught in schools. But it's never been reflected in the change in legislation, which still talks about giving Christianity a particular place and the compulsion. So a very odd situation has developed in which there's a lot of dissatisfaction right through the profession, the teaching profession and in schools about what's happening to RE in schools, because the government seems to have just stepped back and neglected it for the last few decades. And there are some serious problems about under-resourcing, about the subject being made to do loads and loads of things. It's also got a loose boundary with PSHE, and that often gets amalgamated. So RE teachers are often also asked to do things about mental health and extremism or whatever the latest thing is. It's often RE becomes a dumping ground. Or can you just do this as well? So lots of dissatisfaction with it being asked to do loads of things, but they're often not being a qualified teacher, fewer qualified teachers in other subjects, and it not having a national curriculum. Now, the fact it doesn't have a national curriculum, there is no clear way that teachers have in front of them of progression targets and so on and so forth. That's compensated for by the fact that there are local curriculums, as some of you will know. It's the only subject, again, where there are SACRAs, Standing Advisory Academic Recommendation Bodies, which agree a syllabus in Birmingham and in Newham and in wherever it might be. And those syllabuses can be really quite different. So depending on where you go to school, you might get quite a different diet in your RE. There are also now commercial providers, national bodies. That's problematic in itself, because if you buy a curriculum from a national provider, because it's commercial, you can't see what it is. It's not publicly accessible like the rest of the national curriculum. If it's a local authority curriculum, you can, but there's this invisibility. They can't show it because they want you to buy it. So that is a lack of transparency. So lots of all these problems. Okay, let's stop with the problems and see where we should be going with it, which is my question. Quick history of changes in what we think we should be doing in RE. As I said, in 1944, when there was this huge education reform act which made school leaving age 15 and provided free education for all pupils. This was after the Second World War. There was this huge reforming push. The country would be different. Everyone would have opportunity. It's all part of that. And this is crucial, because we're going to talk about ethics as well as religion. The idea was, think about the Second World War. You've been fighting against communism and fascism, and people like Rab Butler, the education minister, and Churchill are thinking, what sort of citizens do we want? What sort of politics do we want in this country? What sort of values do we want? We don't want to make communists. That's very frightening, with the Cold War about to start. We certainly don't want fascists. We've just been fighting them. So how are we going to teach values? How are we going to teach ethics? And there was a framework already, because it was a very Christian country. Most people were baptized in those days and had some Christian, Sunday school and other backgrounds. We'll use Christianity as the vehicle through which we promote, kind of basic citizen, decent values. So RE became non-denominational, except for Catholic schools that opted out, non-denominational, and free churches, including Unitarians, jumped in with the other Protestant churches and agreed with this. We want, all systems should have this non-denominational, not really evangelizing, rather ethical. So if you remember school assemblies where you were taught improving lessons, Bible passages that had morals in them, that was the sort of teaching there was. And Radio 4 had broadcasts in the afternoons that we used to listen to that did that sort of thing, about being kind and considerate and nice and decent and honest and truthful. And RE became very ethicized in that kind of way, because we were going to be, nice democratic citizens, not like those anti-fascists and communists, and RE was part of what was going to help that happen. Churchill called it county council religion, rather disparagingly. So that's the background that is still there, and that we still inherit, and it keeps sort of coming back in some ways. And the churches have the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church still have a lot of stake in all this. Then in 1988 there was another big Education Reform Act under the Conservatives, and that was, if you think back to 1988, it was a very conservative time in religion. Fundamentalism was growing, the new Christian right in the US, and so there was a very powerful voice in Parliament, people like Baroness Cox, opposing reform. They wanted to stick with 1944. It should be Christian instruction. We have to teach them decent values. We don't want change. We don't want to teach other religions. This is a Christian country. There was a huge debate in Parliament with that big pushback. And part of the result of that, there were also people who wanted reform, was that it didn't really get reformed. It didn't go into the national curriculum later on. It was still opt-out and so on. There was a big anti-gay, if you remember at that time, it was AIDS, anti-gay, Clause 28, it was all that era. Yeah. So when everything else was getting reformed, RE got a bit shelved again. Okay. But in the background, as I said, okay, there's been no change sort of legislatively, but in the classroom, a lot is changing. So Britain had become multicultural by then, partly because of post-war immigration. And in 1971, there was a very most boring title of any important document ever, the Schools Council Working Paper 36, which was led by Ninian Smart, who was at Lancaster University. It was always known as the SHAP working group. It was SHAP on the M26 when you're going up. That's where they met, in that hotel. The SHAP working group in 1971 emphasised the importance of the study of all the world's religions, as they called it. In fact, I think it was six religions that kind of got settled on. That was enormously influential in a lot of the local syllabi. At the same time, a different thing was going on in Scotland and now in Wales. So we're getting a splitting up of the different, I don't know if any of you are from Scotland or Wales, but you've got a different thing happening. In Scotland it's called, what's it called, Morals, RME, Morals and Ethics, Religion, Morals and Ethics, RME, I think. And in Wales they've just changed their legislation. It's going to be called Religion, Values and Ethics, RVE. Whereas England is still RE. So Scotland and Wales have gone in a more ethical direction. RE is the place where they want you to teach much more about morals and ethics. In practice, that's happening in England as well, but it's not reflected in the title or in government legislation. And finally, there's a new development in, when was it, 2018, I think it was, the RE Council for England and Wales introduced another working paper which proposes teaching world views. That's their term. So they now they're trying to get this changed. The government won't go along with it, so they're trying to get it through the classroom. So teachers are now thinking more about teaching religion and world views. And what lies behind that is the idea that in an increasingly non-religious society, it shouldn't just be about religious people. Everyone should have a stake, so children who are humanists or atheists or agnostics or whatever it might be, they should also recognise themselves in the curriculum and know about the origins of where their particular ideology comes from. So inclusion is really behind that worldviews approach. But the government's ignoring it, but it's happening more on the ground. So let me pause thoughts. That was a lot very quickly about where we've got to now, both the messes and the positive changes. So I just wanted to set the context, because it is a complicated one, so that we can now address my main question, which is, well, what should it look like? You know, what would we really like to see in RE, in schools, and in PSHE, which stands for, I always forget it, what is it?
Personal, social and health education.
Personal, social and health education. And that goes back to 1944 as well, amazingly. And then there's spiritual in there somewhere.
Economics, I think, is
Well,
there.
no, it's personal, spiritual and health.
Personal, spiritual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Am I right in thinking that there's a different inspection regime for RE?
Yes, you can only inspect a national curriculum subject because it's got attainment targets which you can inspect. RE hasn't got any national attainment targets, so you can't inspect it.
Right.
However, faith schools, which make up about a third of schools, it includes primary and secondary, faith schools have an inspection by their own faith inspection bodies. So they inspect RE. So if you go to a faith school, mostly Church of England or Catholic, you'll have a separate inspection by your own denominational inspection.
For RE, that's
RE.
where it's offset for everything else.
Correct. So those faith schools tend to have a higher standard across the board of RE because it is, they invest in more and it's inspected by their own bodies. But you're right, with other schools, PSHE is inspected by Ofsted, but RE isn't because it hasn't got a national framework that you can inspect it on. And that's part of the reason that it's not taken very seriously by head teachers because they're not going to go on the ranking with it.
Thank you, that really helps.
Any more thoughts or reflections about how we got to where we are, or questions?
Well, what I'm quite sad about it, I started being an RE teacher in the late 70s, and RE was 5% of the curriculum time. And it's nowhere near that now.
It's usually one period a week in most schools, if you're lucky, and often you get PSHE and all sorts of other things in it.
We had 2 lessons a week before the year at times over the States School in Birmingham. And Birmingham had problems with its curriculum because it wants to include communism and humanism was too well fed.
In the 70s and
In the
80s?
70s.
Yes. Yes. Ninian Smart actually put humanism and communism as religions in his book about religious experience of mankind. So, nothing new under the sun. Worldviews is coming back to that today. Why do you think it was so much higher profile in schools then than it is now?
I feel that an RE teacher is treated the same as a history or geography teacher, and an RE teacher could progress quite nicely to head of department, and then they tend to get promoted to heads of year or deputy heads. But I don't encourage anyone now to be an RE teacher because there's no real progression. Very sad.
That's very special.
Behaviour is a big feature in schools, not necessarily connected with PSHE. And basically a lot of schools have a lot of issues in helping kids understand and controlling behaviour, and that is an associated element, I think.
It certainly is, and I'll come to that point in a second. It's a very important point. Any more just questions of clarification or anything that you don't know about that history? Okay, well let's start to think about what we would like it to look like. And I'm going to draw a little bit on a colleague and I did some interviews with teachers of RE in London this summer, and I'm going to just pull out some quotations from them on their view. They're very inspiring, the way they are taking the subject forward, despite this awful handicap that they're working under. But just to pick up Tony's point, it reminds me of this quote from one of them, who says, I think the syllabus, how it's made better, is that it's now acknowledged there's lots of stuff about extremist views, and it's not really scared to tackle those, from right wing or from left wing. We've got so many different areas, from green extremism as well as Muslim extremism. It's good it's improved because when I start teaching it, RE, there was no mention of extremism. We've gone through quite a turbulent time, and I'm proud that's one area that's been introduced. And then we asked him about where does the extremism, where do you find this coming through from the the kids, and he says, often it comes out in their writing. They won't say it in class, but it comes out in their writing. If you ask them to write about a topic like freedom of speech. I've had a couple of kids who wrote some very extreme things, and it's their way of venting. I've had to speak to parents where it's actually come from the parent, and the kid's just mimicking what the parent has said. So there's not one scenario, it's always something different, but you find strategies. Whether it's keeping a copy of the writing, in my most extreme case, where students didn't care and the parents didn't care, I would tell them, I'm monitoring this, it's been written down, it's been recorded, and they kind of understood they needed to be more mindful of what they said. Now that's incredibly important work that those teachers are doing for society. They are performing sort of ethical and political monitoring and improvement role on the hoof. And interesting that RE is a place where that's, well, not surprising really, where that's coming out. Because RE has now, in most schools where it's properly taught, it incorporates ethics and values as well as talking about religion and non-religion, so culture if you like. So it's become quite broadly culture, religion, ethics. Now, ethics can be taught and is taught in many ways in other parts of the curriculum. English teachers will tackle a lot of those issues, for example. Some schools now have very clear value statements, and you can get values-based schools, and they'll make an actual thing of, you've got to feed these values through the curriculum. Even if it's maths, they'll have ways of showing things like perseverance and so on and so forth. So I think that what's happening here in this big societal thing, which I've also been looking at, is that as religion has declined, religion used to kind of be the place you look for moral teaching. But as it's declined, it's not anymore. And so lots of other parts of society have had to take on that role. So every university, every business, it's all got a value statement now. But you can't rely on people having the same set of values. So you have to have your own value statement. Schools have value statements, partly for discipline reasons. But teachers have to become sort of ethical, moral experts. And they're struggling often because they haven't been trained explicitly to do that. What gives you the right? The clergyman had a kind of right to preach on what was right and wrong. Who else in society does? Well, we accept it from them. People don't have an entitlement now. They have to earn kind of ethical respect, I suppose, from people. So values, what I'm saying is that ethics and values work has been distributed across lots of sectors of society now, and it's gone out, it's floated free of the churches and religion. Are you going to say something? Okay. Any thoughts on values and how they're just everywhere? But who's the expert these days?
My daughter-in-law teaches history, and she brings values out in everything she teaches within history.
Could people use the microphone if they're going to make comments, please?
I'm sorry. My daughter-in-law teaches history, and she is bringing values out in almost everything she does, and getting discussion among the young people. So she's using A-level history, actually, to convey values and get the young people to discuss it, but quite separate from ethics, if you like.
Is that because the school as a whole is encouraging it, or is she doing that off her own bat?
I think it's how she teaches. I mean, she gets fantastic results because all the kids are interested, they want to discuss these things. So she's been dealing with the Russian history and American history, and she brings out the values the whole time and gets the kids to discuss it. And that is where she's bringing it out in history.
Mm-hmm. So what do we want RA to look like? One thing perhaps is we want it to cover these big ethical debates and topics that are on students' minds. And yet it's not the only place in the curriculum where that can be done. It is being done in history, in English and other subjects. It doesn't have to be all the responsibility of the RE teacher. RE is also RE. So there has been a bit of a pushback. It did start to turn very much into values teaching. And then the government did push back and make the GCSE more about learning about two religions. And teachers often complain about that. They're kind of torn between having to teach, learn the scriptures, and students want to debate big ethical topics. They love debating that. So there's a bit of a mismatch on that. The A-level is broader and does allow much more debate. But a lot of teachers and pupils that we've spoken to say, once you've got good RE, I love RE because it's the one place we can actually argue and debate and think. We're not just learning stuff for the exam. So when it's done well, it's a wonderful kind of critical space for people to think about, well, is free speech really a sort of absolute value, or are there limits, and what are there? For example, whatever the topic of the day is, students do love it as a space. A lot of our students who come to university say, I loved it because I love the debates. Go on.
Thinking about other subjects, the biology teachers get feedback when they talk about evolution.
Yes, and if
democracy.
If in RE they haven't explained about what creationism is and why most of the world actually believes in creationism, if you take all of Islam and Christianity, then it's much harder for a biology teacher to be able to deal with that. So that brings us on, so let's I'm taking it as we've got some sort of agreement, because it just seems to be the case that that's what students want, that it should have an ethical component in RE, but it can't just be that. You've also got to learn about religions, even if it's partly because there'll be people in the classroom, it's theirs. They're learning about their own traditions. Obviously in a faith school, that's even more the case. But also because of wanting to learn about the world, multicultural, multi-religious world we live in. Religion is a huge factor in the world, in people's lives and in politics, and we would want educated people to understand something about that. We want them to understand why people believe in creationism. They're not all idiots. They've got good reasons for believing that. What are those reasons? What does it mean? What are the arguments for and against, and so on. And it then takes you into the whole debate about religion and science. So it's a ripe for discussion properly, which you can't do in a biology classroom unless you're going to devote hours and hours to that subject. So we want ethics, but we also want to learn about my religious and ethical stance, because we individually as children don't know where it comes from. We just imbue with it from peers and parents. But why am I believing these things? Where does that come from? We want people to be self-aware and self-critical, and we want them to learn about us, i.e. others in my class, because there will be. I can say this clearly now. There will be people who have different beliefs in any one classroom in England and Wales these days. And we want to learn about them. We want to learn about people who have faiths that aren't represented in our classroom as well. And then, what else do we want? I've got a few thoughts, but what else do we want? We want to learn about religions of various kinds. What else do we want? Ethics, religions, mine, yours and theirs. Anything else you want RE to be doing in schools?
Morals. I don't know whether you equate it with
What do you mean by morals? Yes, is it different from ethics?
Well, ethics is generally what you should do, not harm others, etc. Morals would be something like, there are things which do not impose on others because you think it's moral for you to do it. It doesn't mean it's same thing, same explanation applies to the other person. The morality of one person could be completely different from another person's morality. Whereas ethics could be same. I don't know, maybe I'm not making it very clear, but I hope.
No, that's very clear. So morals is a bit more, it's got some authority behind it, objectively saying this is the morals of our school or religion or whatever. Ethics is probably more general values. So yes, we want to learn, don't want just ethical debate, we want to understand why people from different cultures and religions have different moral teachings. And then you can understand them better when you understand why are so many Catholics against abortion? How does it relate to their beliefs and other beliefs? And, where might there be a common value behind it all, even if we don't agree on that issue, and those sorts of, that's learning about others rather than myself. So we want that.
I think it's difficult to learn about ethics and morals without a background to set them against. I'm a retired minister, and I always said we ought to teach our religion, our Christian religion, where I live, so the kids have got something to reject. They've got a background on which to build their moral and their ethic codes. But when they haven't got anything,
Yes.
what, do you just go to Socrates? Or?
Yes. So I think that's exactly right. So we also need to be teaching about, let's call it in the broadest sense, cosmology and theology. You know, is there a God, or are there many gods, or is there a spirit? Different religious people have incredibly different beliefs about that, and it's really important to learn that Hindus believe in many, 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 many gods and goddesses, and spiritualists believe in the spirits of the dead that live on and continue to influence us, and monotheists believe there is only one God, but actually in practice they often recognise angels and demons. We need to think about that and make people confident enough to talk about it without being embarrassed, without stigmatising people with different beliefs. So we need to talk about gods, but we also need to talk about the whole nature of everything. That is one subject that's very specific to religions, the big picture. They do give people a sense of how it all fits together, what the universe looks like, sort of existential ground. And again, they offer very different pictures. And a Christian cosmology, starts with a creation and then has a sort of redemption history, and it'll end with an eschatology when Jesus returns. That used to be the worldview that most people had in this country. It's not anymore. They believe in a more sort of semi-scientific, Big Bang, expanding universe, but they don't necessarily think that, realise that or question it, or it might sort of come from science. Religion's a place you can really examine that. And if you do believe in that worldview, where are the gods and spirits? And that worldview is actually much more compatible with the Asian religions than the monotheist religions. Really interesting for students to debate that. They love debating that. So I think we should, it shouldn't just be about ethics. As you say, you've got to understand where people are coming from. If you think there's a personal God directly monitoring you and going to judge you, that has a huge difference on your ethics than if you don't think that's true. So you can't leave it out as a picture in a hurry.
Can I just interject? Just happened to me that I have a very good example, I hope. For example, for a Christian, it might be their moral duty to spread it everywhere in the whole world. But as a Hindu, I find it very unethical. So there is a
That's a great example to discuss, yes. Hindus and Jews don't proselytize, but they have very deep convictions. Yes.
Maybe a bit tangentially refers to what I'm going to talk about, which is really about people who are engaged in teaching, whether they believe certain things themselves, to what extent it's confessional, whether there's been any change in that over the years, whether previously religious education teachers, going back 50 or 60 years, were more religious people themselves and therefore had an interest in it. Is there anything around that, Steve?
No one's ever researched that. It's probably quite ethically difficult to find out. But I'll tell you anecdotally, I myself, because I teach religions, have changed. When I started teaching 30-something years ago, students used to say, well, what do you believe then? And I used to say, I'm not going to say because I don't want to influence you in the classroom. But when they say it these days, I say, I'm extremely religious. And they're absolutely But I think that because I'm responding to the fact the classroom is much more non-religious, it's harder for the Muslims and the Christians to speak out. So I think if I say that, it gives them a bit more opportunity. Yes.
So I suppose a hobby horse of mine, but thinking about science and the Big Bang, Kaufman, the American theologian, came up and we've got the mystery of creation. And many theologians I talk about either dismiss it or don't know him. Is that and I'm
hasn't really been in the view, it has a view course.
Well, has it percolated to many theological departments and universities?
Say the view again.
Kaufman, he believes that God is the mystery of creation and it emanates from there. He was a Harvard professor, divinity professor, and he was a Mennonite. And it strikes me as a beautiful theology. Yeah, when I speak to some of my theological colleagues, I say, one of my students looked at him and thought somebody else was slightly better. It does make it a slightly personal God, but it explains it in modern day terms.
I can't answer how much that's taught, but I think that when I say RA should teach theology, it needs to teach the basics of. You can believe God is a personal being that you have a relationship with. You can believe that the divine is impersonal spirit or mystery, and it's in effort. That's different for you. And you can believe that the spirits are many and manifold, and they're all around us, and they're good and evil. And you teach the basics of a range of views that there are, and you shouldn't miss out any view. Because our culture defaults, particularly if you're not all that religious, people just default to a kind of basic monotheism and think that all religious people believe there's a God, like Richard Dawkins attacks, and that's not true. It's just not true.
Can I just ask a question? Thinking about stepping outside different world faiths and religions, and you probably touched on this, but is there any room or any scope for looking at the function of religion in society, and is that discussed?
Yes, thank you. So I think you're absolutely right. I said that, I thought that was my final point. Power and influence in religion and non-religion is a really important subject. I'm a sociologist, so I would say that, but these aren't just ideas. It's not just a battle of ideas. There are armies and states and powerful people and business interests pushing some ideas and not other ideas. And unless people understand that, and unless they also understand that religion can be very abusive, they're not understanding what religion is and how powerful it is and how people try and turn it to their ends and use it and how you respond to that. So I think thank you for saying that, you're absolutely right. We have to talk about that as well.
I'm hearing all these wonderful ideas about how we think religious education should be, but I can't stop thinking about the perspective of parents. How much does the view of parents, and in particular having some parents that are probably very religious and want their children, basically, as far as I can see, indoctrinated in their religion, and other parents who maybe don't care, other parents who maybe see it as a waste of time. How does this diversity of view of parents and how they want their children raised, how does that influence the various curriculums across the country?
Well, it does influence it because there's, legislatively, there is a human right that parents can have their children educated in their own faiths. And that is kind of respected in this country, more than many, which is why there are church women's schools, and there are Catholic schools, and now there are some Hindu schools, and there are some Muslim schools, and there are general
So is it easy for parents to be able to find the religious content of a school that exactly matches their desire for their child? I thought that would be very difficult.
No, but they can find, well, if they're in the bigger, more powerful religions, they can find a school. And they, because of the faith entrance criteria of faith schools, it gives them big advantage because they go up the list of criteria and they can get in. So if you're religious as a family, you're going to get a better pick of schools. If you're non-religious, you get a worse pick.
I've actually got a more important question.
Yep.
And that is, is there a sense of responsibility to enable a child who is brought up in a very religious household to be educated sufficiently to be able to choose for themselves how they want to embrace religion in their own lives? In other words, overcome the indoctrination of their parents.
That's a great question. Because there's a big debate between, let's look internationally, there's a huge debate between countries about whether you should teach religion in schools at all, and as you know, a lot don't. Because they think this should be for the family, it's a private matter. Britain doesn't think that. It thinks that there should be some coverage of it. But that's another thing that RE curriculum should do, which is secure enough pluralism that people can see their other views and can become more critical of the view that they're brought up in. And if they're brought up with a very narrow view, that's an incredibly important function. And to understand that actually there are Christians who don't believe what I believe, and there are people non-Christian altogether, is a really crucial thing that should be happening in school education. We are at the end of our time, but we're going to have some workshops. So let me just sum up what we've been talking about. I've talked about the whole background and history of RE and why it is so freighted with huge expectations about creating good citizens, ethical people, religiously literate people, all those things, tolerant and so on. But how, on the other hand, the government doesn't support it, really, with a curriculum or resources, so that's causing a decline in the status of the subject. But we've been, I hope, we've been convincing ourselves it's an incredibly important subject. Even though there's this huge push on education generally to go down economic productivity, make them career focused, it's crucial that there's good RE and that it covers ethics and religion, mine and other people's, and cosmology, and culture, and power, and influence. And that's what we all want to see one day, I hope.
Yes, actually, I could listen forever, but there is one question which I really would like us to impinge on our next time, Could you tell us what you think we should have?
That's what I think we should have. I wouldn't prescribe the order you do it in, whether you start with ethics and then you do the religion and then you do the theology, but I think you have to have them all in the mix, and it's up to the teacher in their locality who will know. I mean, if you start off by getting students to think about their own religion, that would be much too exposing of students. So that's probably not going to work in most schools, unless they're very safe spaces. You might want to start off by othering and talking about what religions do. You might want to start with an ethical debate to get students talking about their view safely. And then you say, well, have you realised that people in other religions and humanism have a different view for these reasons? Then you get into cosmology. So I wouldn't prescribe the order you do it in, but I think it has to remain this broad field that covers ethics and religion and my views and non-religion and theological questions.
Do you think we have the trained teachers to do this?
Not enough. There are some who are fantastic and doing it brilliantly, but some schools don't have any qualified teachers, a lot, over half. And then you just get anyone who might be a Christian or a Hindu to come and teach it.
Well, I think if we wanted to have something that helped us along this question, we couldn't have had anything better than Linda. It really.
Can I ask another question as well?
You want another question?
I'd like to ask Linda a question.
I'm listening.
Linda?
Yep.
In countries, America and France, for example, religion is not part of the state system, they're separate. And presumably you've looked at these and seen how it affects religious education, whether it makes any difference to the way people are brought up, whether their religion is confined to their faith organisation or their family. And the schools just keep out of it. The schools presumably just concentrate on the ethics, or nothing at all in relation to your family.
Well, in theory, they are strict separation, and it doesn't mean they don't do prayers, say. But in practice, they do teach religion, because they find you just have to these days. But it's done through history, or it's done through English, or it's done through. I mean, it is very revealing that actually you can't not teach religion. And of course, the danger of not doing religion in schools is that then people are just told this is what all Christians believe by their family. And that is part of the reason I think why fundamentalism is so much bigger in America than it is here. Because there is no, they are trying schools now more, but there isn't so much opportunity to debate that, get another view. I think we are quite lucky in that we have got it, we just need to build on what we've got.
It's not the answer to kick it out.
It's not the answer to kick it out. They're not shining examples of how much better it is if you do that. They still have to smuggle it in somehow.
Thank you.
There's another
Can I ask
point.
a very, no, let's just carry on.
We've got plenty of time to.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I was wanting to speak to a Mormon. It was just on a Zoom meeting, but what is your view on this? What is your and they can only, well, this particular person can only give a corporate. This is what we believe. What do you believe? And one day I met some Mormons again, smartly dressed up, very happy to talk about their religion. I said, oh, yeah, can I set up an interfaith meeting? And they weren't that interested because they only wanted to propagate their point of view and not really discuss the differences or similarities between their point of view and another. And how do you engage with someone like that who can only, they don't seem to have a muscle which seems to, about their own personal as an individual, their point of view. It's only, this is what we believe. It's almost like a past political broadcast, this is what we believe. And I say, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but I kept digging, what do you believe? No, this is what we believe, and it was never, this is what I believe.
Yes.
Don't envy them.
Yes. No, that is very true of some more sectarian groups. I think you can't confront that, you couldn't obviously confront someone about that in the class personally, but if they hear other people talking about it, partly, personally, they're seeing, oh, actually it's not the only way. And if you talk about abuse of power as well, and how agents do that, then one day maybe that's a useful thing for them to understand.
I think one of the fundamental things you have to question is that you put ethics and religion together. And a number of religious people said that all our ethics come from religion. But as an anthropologist, sociologist, you must appreciate that they have evolved because successful societies actually do have those ethics. Successful societies collaborate. They do not lie to each other. They do not cheat with basic ethics. Okay, it's tuned into religion so that the society can run efficiently. But the fact that some people seem to think that these ethics are imposed upon us by some exterior element, as opposed to evolving naturally, is quite fundamental. And I think when you look at the ethics, for instance, I'm quite surprised that Confucius, their beliefs are that you should defend the family. So if somebody in the family has done something wrong, you would lie to help them because that is considered ethical. And I think Buddha went to a group of people where they said they'd had so many gurus, they said this is the right religion, this is the right one. And rather than saying what he believed, he said, well, do you think a society where people cheat is good? No. Do you think this is good? No. And he said, well, assess it for yourself. Well, I think that is a fundamental thing, that ethics can be separated from religion, and not necessarily, one is not dependent on the other.
No, that was like a conversation.
I don't know if there's so much of a question in this, but I'm quite interested in the sort of larger view of sort of a whole holistic school involvement or even the wider community. There's a school in South Manchester that holds what's called Spiritual Awareness Day, and they bring in a number of representatives from different faiths, because Manchester has such a huge diversity, collection of faiths. And each faith has their own sort of small classroom that people, the students opt to go to the Hindu lecture or to the Jain lecture or so forth. And they have sort of a 40-minute talk about that faith. And then afterwards in the afternoon, there's a roundtable discussion where the students then can bring the question, so what's your faith's belief on abortion? And then the individuals have that sort of capacity to engage in those questions. It's always been sort of quite an enriching experience to see a whole school being involved, and then actually bringing in people from the wider community to be engaged as well.
That's great, and some schools who are brilliantly, and they do that. There's always the SAP phrase being that there's a local engagement of different And that can be used really well. I'm going to read you one little quote that I really liked from another teacher interview. And he said, I decided to look, this is in his RE lessons, at how did mosques develop in the UK. And I looked at the website for resources, and they say, well, mosques are like this and they haven't been erected. But actually, when I looked into it, it wasn't like that in Britain, because they started with houses, because they didn't have mosques. He's in a Muslim school and area. And so I started looking into that, the worshipping houses, how it all began, and then how things like East London Mosque grew. And it became a really interesting subject about the history of migration in the UK. And some of my pupils had parents and grandparents who've been part of that story. So it's a really great example, and then he takes them to look at them. If you just start with the resources, it says mosques are like this, and it sort of takes that from the Middle East. But it's not really helping you understand cultural religious development in the UK. So if you go to a local area and you ask people and you think about it, and then you get the students interested in how this developed and how long this mosque's been here, and take them to see it. He did that after all. That was a really successful learning thing about migration, cultures, and religion. So it's wonderful when that does happen.
I was just interested about ritual. It seems to me that ritual is something that young people are interested in. And we can talk about football, or we can talk about music festivals in the same language as, traditional rites of passage, weddings and baby namings and baby showers and baby reveals and, candle lighting and maze walking, whatever. But it strikes me that ritual, which perhaps when I was growing up in the late 70s and early 80s was very unfashionable, and you seem to be right weirdy beardy if you want to do any of that. Seems to have become, into whether people are jumping over a hot pole, or the notion of hand fasting, or the notion of ritual seems to have become a little bit more visible. And I think that that's something that would lead very nicely into what's the theology behind some of that ritual.
That's a great idea, teaching me. If you say, well, what sort of wedding would you like? Or if somebody close dies, what sort of funeral? And then why? Because you have very different views now. There used to be a funeral was just a Christian burial. It's not now. There's any number of things you can do, including not having a funeral at all. Direct cremation, nothing, no ritual. So talking about why and what it tells you about what people value. If you look at graves, I like walking around churchyards these days, they used to be policed and you couldn't put stuff up except the gravestone. Now you'll find a dream catcher, a whirlwind, a bench, a football strip, who's a football fan, things that the person liked, all sorts of things. That angels have come back in a big way. Very interesting to say what's that telling us about belief in what's happened to the dead and how we relate to them. All great ways of teaching things. And trees have come back in.
You haven't said anything about spirituality.
I'm thinking about that. What do you mean by spirituality?
Well, the definition I like comes from Owen Thomas, who's a Catholic theologian, who said it's the time of all uniquely human capacities and functions: self-awareness, self-transcendence, memory, anticipation, rationality, creativity, plus the moral, intellectual, social, political, aesthetic and religious capacities, all of them as embodied.
Oh my goodness, well that's too much theory. But funnily enough, spirituality is much more explicitly handled in primary schools and secondary schools. Partly because kids are less self-conscious and they're more open to talking about it. And primary schools often do spirituality in their assembly really, really well. And then once people hit about 13, then they're too embarrassed to talk about those sorts of things, so it's harder to do. But I don't think you can do all those things you mentioned in the RE curriculum. Hopefully the whole school will do a lot of those things. But I do think talking about gods and divine beings, whatever, which were sort of excluded from the world religions curriculum, is really important to bring that back in.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a very similar question, and that is, a lot of people these days consider themselves spiritual, but not religious. So it's another way I think of asking that same question. So the question becomes, how is spirituality distinct from religion being addressed within religious education? Because that is what is relevant.
It's a great question, because you're right about the growth and interest in spirituality. And it sort of was addressed in the overall religions curriculum because in the 70s and 80s that interest was very much focused on Eastern religions and they were being taught, but now that phase is gone. And actually what's spirituality, what's become more visible amongst younger people is astrology and tarot and all those sort and Wicca, the revival of witchcraft, paganism, very big growth in these kinds of alternative spirituality. Satanism, Jedi Knights, much more choice. And actually, I think they should be included in the RA curriculum, as well as the Eastern, the yoga, the Bible, and all those things. Because as you say, they're very meaningful, and they're not just for the young people; they're parents now. That's what they'll have experienced from their parents. So I would really like to see that come in, because otherwise they get stigmatised as sort of superstition and nonsense, and there's much more to them than that. Thank you for raising that.
I know we're talking about education, but it making me think more and more, the sort of generalisation that's going on here, are we going to lose the need of places for people to come and join in worship, or what they like to call it?
That's a big question. It is, it's going, isn't it? Churches are closing, left, right, centre. People don't seem to want that kind of communal worship experience in the way they did. Whether that's related to what's happening in school, I don't know. But it's a phenomenon. And it's going to be a huge headache for the historic churches, what they do with all the buildings. And interestingly, there was, did you hear about the national, what's it called, the National Assemblies? No. The Sunday Assembly, thank you. That was a movement which said people still want community and to gather together every Sunday. They just don't want God. Well, actually, it's not true. It's not done very well. People don't want to gather together on a Sunday morning. They want to go and walk.
One of the reasons we sort of organised this conference was to look at where we go in situations where churches are closing, and I didn't know much about RE in schools, but you feel it's sort of disappearing in one way, it's being substituted. And I was thinking of an example. I come from Bolton. We set up the Bolton Interfaith Council, and part of that created a faith trail. So every year we take about 2,000 or 3,000 different kids. They do a circle of different places of worship. The whole school would go to a mosque and hear about the mosque and experience being inside the mosque. And then they'd move on to a temple and hear about the temple, what beliefs there. And then they'd end up in either the church of England or one of the churches. And we felt that was a good way of bringing understanding of other faiths. You don't teach other faiths, but you want people to understand it. And we have this motto, knowledge dispels fear. And if we know about how the others work, we can live with each other.
Yes. And these days, you probably want to add in, you want to add in going to the graveyard and looking at people's practices, and you want to add in looking at TikTok, to look at WitchTok and all the things they're looking at. They're learning a lot about religion on their phones now. You can bring that into the teaching for all the same reasons that you were doing that.
You seem to say earlier on that you approved of the church as managing schools. I just wonder whether that's embedding inequality in our society, because it's not that people want to follow the religion, it's that they want the schooling.
Yes.
And that reinforces the religion, but actually it excludes a large number of children who then go to the second level of school, if you like, and it embeds the inequality, and that is important to me. What do you think about that?
I think it does embed inequality. That's proven by lots of studies, having faith schools. But what I've argued you do about that is not that you get rid of faith schools. You can't. I mean, the churches own them. You can't just get rid of them. But that you get rid of selective admission by faith. So anyone can go to any faith school they want.
Yep. I think we will cheer about that.
Or non-faith.
Yeah. Well, you've experienced what it's like to talk to a Unitarian audience, right? We become very involved and very interested. And when you have a speaker that is very knowledgeable and can respond, it really catches alive. Thank you very, very much.
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's really good, really super. Thank you so much.